to me is that, what is the right answer? Who knows? They were talking on the latest Eternal Glory podcast, which came out today, about how Brian and Phil are both very successful in Legacy and, very good players, and they disagree all the time on things like mulligans because they play different styles and they just don't see the game the same way.
Yeah, I used to do a ton of team drafting, and the best team that I was ever on was me and two people. Like, everybody was good in the league, but two people who we just fundamentally disagreed about pick orders. The format was Ether Revolt Limited. And as a consequence, it was the clearest signals I could ever have of just, because our preferences were so different, they knew if they passed me a certain card, I'd take it. I knew if they passed a certain card, they were doing something very unusual for them.
Cool. Well, let's get into this. Let me do a quick introduction and just say, hi, welcome back to the YouTube channel. We're talking about the draft that we can't stop talking about. I have not stopped talking about this one draft, and it's a draft that I said on video I did not go well, which I guess actually in some ways makes for more interesting conversation, because if you just found the open lane and slammed all of your great cards, then how much is there to discuss? Probably still a lot, but there's even more to discuss here because that's not what happened in this draft. It went a little off the rails. This is the draft that I eventually did a coaching session with Brian Koval. That video is also on the channel. And today, I'm also getting some insight from another much better Magic player. I have Zach Barash on the line. He is a writer for Hipsters of the Coast, game designer. What house do you want to be credited?
No, that's perfect.
Great.
Writer for Hipsters of the Coast, game designer. That's me.
Accomplished drafter, maybe is a good way to put it. So, we're going to dive into this. You were very kind enough to, you offered to help me get better at Magic when I expressed on Twitter that I wanted to get better at playing Magic. And you were like, hey, if you ever want to talk about things, I'm always down to talk about Magic from a deep strategy perspective. So you were kind enough to make some notes about this draft for me because I was like, hey, here's a draft where I tried hard, and it's an environment that I know, right? It's my cube that I play the most of any cube probably and have been very familiar with for, 5 or 6 years. So if there's ever a draft where I should be held accountable for my decisions, it is this one. And I think it'd be interesting for us to talk about it now. Do you have anything you want to say before we get into just looking at the picks?
I feel like the picks are going to showcase a whole bunch of this discussion. We have fully annotated notes based on every pack, but also thanks for doing this. You
don't
do
thank me.
Ton
thank
for
you.
the community, so I was more than happy to be able to give back to you in a very small way.
Well, I think this will be really interesting because, people, they'll do pack one, pick ones and stuff like that, but I don't see anyone ever really going deep on analyzing a draft of a cube. So I think there's a lot to break into here. So we'll get the first pack here, and there's already plenty for us to discuss. So I had flagged Balance, Skull Clamp, and Gaia's Cradle as the top 3 cards in the pack, and I think you more or less agreed, though after that our evaluations diverted.
Yes, I agree with you. Those are the 3 most powerful cards in the pack. I'm looking at Ancient Tomb and Preordain here. Skull Clamp kind of has the lowest opportunity cost. Balance and Gaia's Cradle, certain things need to go right. But yeah, I'm on board with you. I think all 3 of those card picks are eminently defensible.
Yeah, and I think it is kind of demonstrates an aspect of my cube, which is that they're the most powerful cards, and they are not just windmill slams in any deck, any of them, right? Like, you need to draft in a way to maximize their potential, and the way this draft went, I did not maximize the potential of my first pick here. Things got a little weird. The first thing I wanted to address was just the Ancient Tomb thing, because it's interesting. I really appreciate getting your perspective on the cube, because I have a certain play group. My cube is probably drafted mostly by the same, 16 to 20 people, and so I don't get a lot of outside perspective on it. And Ancient Tomb, my play group is kind of just settled on the fact that it's almost a trap in this cube, just because of how low curving it is, how many fetch and shock lands you get, and they're already pressuring your life total, how good aggro is. They're basically I need to draft. It's a real build around. I have to just draft a deck that has a lot of 3 and 4 drops, and it's also just hard to do that. So I no longer look at that as a pack one, pick one thing, but do you expect that evaluation is just off?
That's a fair point. The thing that's going to come up over and over again is you're the expert at this cube. You have drafted it. You have crafted it.
I have a lot of experience. Let's say that. I have a lot of experience with this cube.
And it makes sense to me that in a fairly low curve, designed by somebody who is notably very down on lifelink and life game.
Yeah.
A bunch of the ways that Ancient Tomb really sings might not exist here. Even if we look at this pack, it's probably best with Skull Clamp. It's still very good in Fiery Confluence style decks, and it theoretically works with Otawara, but not in any meaningful way. So this pack doesn't give you much to be excited about with Ancient Tomb, and this cube might have less than the average cube does, especially given how painful the mana base can be.
Yeah, there's not a lot of too generic mana costs in spells across the entire cube, so it really is kind of a build-around thing. It's actually interesting. We could talk more about cube design at some point too, but I'm really kind of narrowing in on this like 3-drop tribal deck that I want to build around cards like Collective Company and Savin's Reclamation, and now maybe Winota even, like getting some 3-drop humans in there. And I think it kind of fits in that deck, where it's like, if you want 3 drops because you have cards that reward having 3 drops, then maybe playing your 3-drop on turn 2 is worth it. You'll have enough of them. You can actually reliably have one in your hand with Ancient Tomb. But that's the only thing I think I maybe disagreed on. Otherwise, I think it's kind of a toss-up here between these best cards. What would you actually take here? I ended up taking Skull Clamp. What are you taking?
I think I'm with you. I think I take Skull Clamp. I think it goes in the most decks, and I think it's a fun card to play with. I think Gaia's Cradle and Balance can both are going to have a higher fail rate where they don't make your deck at all.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to say, too, because I got some comments on this video, that I will definitely play Gaia's Cradle in non-green decks, but I don't feel like it's first pickable in non-green decks, right? Like, if I take it first pick, it's because I really want to be maximizing the potential of it, and I think you need to be in green to do that. I'll play a Gaia's Cradle in a white aggro deck with a lot of artifacts and stuff, but as we just talked about with Ancient Tomb, like, not a lot of places to put 2 generic mana. If you're playing Gaia's Cradle on an off-color deck, it's producing effectively generic mana, so I really got to have I want to have a white aggro deck with stuff like Grafted War Gear and Smuggler's Copter before I'm really interested in dropping a Gaia's Cradle in there. Mm-hmm. Anyway, pack 2 here. What are your thoughts about this pack?
Here, I think we're still in agreement. You had pointed out that Craterhoof would have gone really well with the Gaia's Cradle.
Yeah.
But you didn't take that, and that's fine. The cards that stand out most to me are Dismember, Remand, and Bloodstained Mire, with Grafted War Gear as the kind of card or Elite Spellbinder is the kind of card you could wheel to play with your Skull Clamp.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think all of those are defensible. This cube breaks Singleton on fetch lands, which makes them a little bit less valuable. And it's all shocks. There's no alpha beta duels or tri-lands, which makes the fetches a little bit weaker. But I still like shoring up mana bases. And there's a very good chance the Bloodstained Mire will go in a deck with Skull Clamp.
I think this is a really interesting point too. Is just where do fetch lands fall in your overall pick order, right? And for me, it's like they're right below probably like the top 5% of the cube. So if a card's not within like the best 15 or 20 cards in the cube, I'm probably just taking a fetch land over it this early until I'm committed to a deck. And that's what I ended up doing here. Though I agree that Dismember also a very equally open pick. And yeah.
And I'm with you there. Like, one thing that I think is going to come up as this draft goes on is we're looking at slight deviations in personal preferences, whereas both you and I are people who are very happy to pick up fetch lands.
Yeah. Here's where we get the first real different perspective on things. So I see this pack, and it's a pick 3 Murktide Regent. And by my evaluation, I think the best blue cards in my cube in order are probably Murktide Regent, Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, then your Ponders, Preordains, Brainstorms probably is how I would rate the most powerful cards in the cube. And I know that you have a different perspective in that. So I saw this and was like, I'm taking Murktide Regent. This is a sign that no one passing to me, or at least the 2 seats past me, are not in blue. And you did not see it that way.
Well, my question for you is, what makes do you believe Murktide Regent is a massive power outlier in most high power level cubes? Or is there something unique to your cube that makes it more powerful?
I think in most cubes it is probably just fine. The same way that Treasure Cruise is just fine. But in my cube, it is only a 360 card cube, and we are drafting 2 sets of every fetch. I do have tons of cantrips, right? I have Singleton cantrips, but I go all the way down to Sleight of Hand, right? So everything Sleight of Hand and better is in this cube in blue. I've got Urza's Bauble and Mishra's Bauble and a bunch of other cheap ways to fuel Delve, and I've just found that it plays you could definitely draft a deck here, and I did not end up doing this, right? I took the Murktide Regent, and the deck did not end up functioning like this at all. So, I think maybe you were vindicated in how the deck ended up because it was not a good Murktide Regent deck. But I think a good Murktide Regent deck can genuinely get this thing into play, turn 4, basically. And at that point, because the cube is so low curving, there is so little removal that can actually hit a Murktide Regent, right? It's there, but it's generally lower priority than things like Lightning Bolts and, stuff that Unholy Heats, and even Disfigure, honestly, is kind of a toss-up for me with a Doomblade. I don't have actual Doomblade, but I have Heartless Act and a couple other 2-mana hard removal spells. I'll usually take a Disfigure in this cube over one of those spells, which then you get punished for when your opponent plays a Murktide Regent. So it's two things, really. I think Delve is a lot easier to enable here than maybe you expect, and I also think that it is pretty darn hard to remove a Murktide Regent once it resolves. I mean, all things considered.
And that's a relevant point, that Murktide Regent might be closer to True Name Nemesis in this format than it is in almost any other.
Mm-hmm.
But
really importantly, though, like if I have that evaluation of Murktide Regent, but the people that I'm drafting with don't, then I just got like a false signal that blue was open when in fact maybe it's not at all, and someone else is just saying, well, the best blue card in this pack is Ponder, and they took Ponder over Murktide Regent or something,
And I think the difference in evaluation here, rather than a strict right-wrong, is I see you taking Murktide Regent, and I think, I don't think that's as powerful as Andy is, but it might be in this format. But Murktide Regent is a specific card. It's not just going to go into every deck, and it's not just going to go into every single blue deck. And because I'm not seeing it as this like big neon flashing light that blue is open and this is one of the strongest cards in the cube, I'm looking to stay open here rather than commit to something that feels fairly narrow, even if it's very powerful.
Yeah. And so the open pick to you would be just one of these fetch lands, presumably, or do you commit a little harder to our early picks and take a Thalia to go with Skull Clamp? Like, what feels less like a... Because I agree, Murktide Regent is certainly a deviation from Skull Clamp, non-blue fetch, right? Which is our first two picks.
Yeah, there are 5 cards that really stand out to me with one to focus on for the wheel. There's the 3 fetch lands. There's Thalia if we go Skull Clamp, heavy white aggro. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of Golos, but everything that I know about you in this cube suggests Golos is probably not going to be very good at doing most of the things it does. It's very slow. It's vulnerable. So I probably wouldn't take it here.
It's almost like combo piece with Field of the Dead to me, I think. I think Golos is like, if you don't have Field of the Dead or some other really good land to get with it, then you're not playing Golos really to just like play it, get your 5th color of mana, and hope that dumping 7 mana into the top of your deck is the way to go.
Which is my idea of fun.
Right, yeah.
And the 6th card is the Blood Crypt, which is a potential thing to wheel with both the Bloodstained Mire that we already have and every single fetch land in this pack.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably looking at either Arid Mesa, Scalding Tarn, or Thalia. Just like Arid Mesa and Scalding Tarn keep us open. Arid Mesa probably goes in all the best Skull Clamp decks, and Thalia, if we commit to white aggro, is going to be the best card with that.
And there's obviously going to be like, we're just going to have different power level or different like card assessments here, which I'm interested in learning from you because I think yours are probably pound for pound more on point. But I also am interested in talking more abstractly about, so what do you think of just drafting to stay open in a powerful cube like this? Do you think that functionally works, that you can like stay open in the same way you can stay open in a retail limited draft?
I think it really depends on the nature of the cube. Obviously, like full well just how many different types of cube there are, but in a high power level format like this, I'm generally expecting decks to either be very focused or very broad. Mm-hmm. So a lot of probably maybe half the drafters at the table can sort of waffle around, see what's open, take a bunch of fixing, and then end up just playing a pile of good cards with a couple of synergies. And then a couple people are going to commit really hard of like, the person with the Gaia's Cradle isn't going to be that interested in these fetch lands. Mm-hmm. They're going to have very narrow focus on what they're looking for. If there's a mono green, a mono white, a mono red deck, those are sort of classic archetypes that you commit early, and if it's open, you're rewarded. I like to stay open. And yeah, I see Murktide Regent as one of those narrow cards, which could be one of those big payoffs. I feel like I've already lost sight of the question at this point.
Well, so like, I guess if you do like to draft and stay open, like, does that mean to you just taking flexible cards over powerful cards early, as opposed to taking like, like one way people describe drafting to stay open is like, well, the first 5 or 6 picks, like pretend you didn't take your first picks, just take the best card out of every pack and like see where you end up after 5 or 6 picks, or do you like prioritize specifically like flexibility, knowing that there's going to be inevitably powerful cards that come later on because it is cube?
Yeah, in most cubes, especially higher power level cubes, I'm not going to worry that much about them anything but the biggest power level outliers. Mm-hmm. Like, there's nothing quite like a Minsc and Boo, but or an Oko Thief of Crowns, but right. Like, there's a million Grave Titans. Sure, Grave
Mm-hmm.
Titan does what it does, but most cubes are going to have plenty of that top end. And if there isn't something that's completely irreplaceable, I'm going to take interchangeable pieces that'll go into a variety of different decks. And part of that is I really like drafting multicolored good stuff decks.
Sure.
I have built a bit of a reputation online of drafting like multicolored blue based control decks. That don't have inevitability, but or they're like control tempo decks where they'll lose to the slower decks. They need to turn the corner. And so, yeah, at this point, I'm with you pick for pick. I'm probably taking Scalding Tarn here because Scalding Tarn, Bloodstained Mire, they have some overlap. They're probably going to go in the same deck. And those, as long as I get some fetchables, those are almost certainly going to make almost any deck I'll make.
Yeah, it definitely strikes me that there's two different ways you can draft to stay open. And what I'm doing, whether right or wrong here, is just being like, well, I assume that I'm seeing this really powerful card. I think it's a power outlier here. I'm going to have to just assume my other drafters, agree with my assessments. I don't know that you can ever like. I think it's hard to make any kind of judgment if you just like throw your hands up in the air and say, well, I don't know any other people think, so I can't bother trying to imagine it. But there's a difference between just taking the most powerful cards that come down the lane and specifically taking flexible cards with like you've kind of already somewhat committed to a plan there. The plan being to play a like bigger deck with more colors in it that is going to take advantage of whatever it wheels. And that's also a way to stay open as opposed to just like, well, I took a aggro card, then a fetch land, now I'm going to take a like, blue-red Spellslinger card, which is basically what Murktide Regent is.
And that's a question of how many different permutations of a certain deck can a table afford. Most decks are only going to be able to hold 1.5 mono white, 1.5 mono red, one blue red spells drafter. A table can probably have at least 3 people who are in multicolored good stuff piles.
Yeah.
And that's an archetype that's just more conducive to staying open. But yeah, I don't think it's wrong per se to commit hard, especially if Murktide Regent is a major power level outlier. But yes, this is the first inflection point where I think you're committing to something powerful but narrow.
Yeah.
And my instinct is to take something less powerful, more replaceable, but more likely to make whatever our finished deck is.
And it is worth noting that I think both Skullclamp and Murktide Regent, if we, concede my power level evaluations for a moment, they're both power outliers, but for very different decks. I'm not going to have a deck that can maximize both realistically, or really, really unlikely to have a deck that's going to maximize both, because they want very different things to make them powerful, to enable them. So I'm kind of like, by taking that, I'm kind of inherently giving up on one of them, right? Whereas by taking Fetchland, like you're describing, I'm still leaving myself open to be a great Skullclamp deck, and then I can get some other different, more powerful card later on that it can also synergize with that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The next pack is, I think, probably a very similar thing. I took Treasure Cruise for very similar reasons to why I took the Murktide Regent, and you were on Smuggler's Copter here, I think, which definitely makes sense given that it is colorless, goes in any deck with creatures in it, just like Skullclamp is colorless and goes in any deck with creatures in it. And so in your spot, we'd be on very flexible fetch lands and, colorless spells that just want you to have creatures in your deck.
Yeah, this I think is our first real disagreement about power level, where I'm used to Treasure Cruise in different formats where even in Vintage Cube, it's good, but it's not incredible. This cube probably has more ways to enable it, but Smuggler's Copter is just such a disgustingly powerful card and isn't exclusive to aggressive decks, whereas Treasure Cruise works very nicely with Murktide, but is committing to an even more narrow lane, where now it's not just like trade cards and then recoup some of that by converting previous cards into mana. Having 2 very expensive Delve spells means if you cannot quickly get Delve online and multiple times, some of your cards may just not function.
Yeah, and that's what I ended up with in this draft. I ended up with a deck that did not have basically any... I basically saw almost no cantrips in this draft, or the ones I did see, I was kind of forced to take Fixing or something else that my deck absolutely needed. And so I have very few cantrips, and I did end up with a fine number of fetch lands. I want to say like 6 or something, which is kind of average-ish for a deck in my cube. But 6 fetch lands does not a Murktide Regent and a Treasure Cruise turn on, right? That's just kind of bare minimum for reasonable casting of Delve spells.
And yeah, this pack is also interesting in that there's nothing super exciting to wheel. There's Death Shadow is like a powerful build around. The white deck gets to wield maybe a Fairy Godmother. The blue deck maybe gets to wield a Negate. So this pack is not sending signals about what is open at this point. We've just got 3 power level outliers and some fixing.
Yeah. Then next, this pack, I ended up taking this Bloodstained Mire over a Daze or a card that would be otherwise off color, because at this point I only have blue cards and fetch lands and colorless cards. What was your feedback on this pack? I can't quite remember. I think you basically said that, hey, if we committed to this direction, then I guess this is what we're doing, right? Like you'd be in a different spot by now, but in service of giving feedback on the draft as it went, given that we did take Treasure Cruise and Murktide Regent, the fetch land probably makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm along the ride with you. I think Daze and the fetch land are both defensible. I like the fetch land here, both because it kind of stays open, but also it is a non-spell that'll feed your main game plan.
Yeah, it does help with the delving of things. So I take that Bloodstained Mire, and then we get this pack. Here you said you're jamming Lingering Souls, which I jammed to the Wandering Emperor in kind of a similar fashion. Like I saw that as a similar sign that white was open. So talk through this. Talk through your feedback on this pack, basically.
Sure. So this is a good looking pack. I like that Fatal Push. I like the Prismatic Vista. We're not taking either one. We are getting a reasonably strong white signal here with 3 strong white cards.
Mm-hmm.
My concern about the Wandering Emperor is it's definitely a very powerful card, but it is, especially when paired with blue, it's going to be part of a controlling blue deck, which is going to be happy to have Treasure Cruise, but is not always going to be great at using Treasure Cruise. A blue controlling deck might not be spewing cards as quickly to fuel Delve, and Murktide Regent is going to be harder to work alongside just sort of Wandering Emperor is going to play well in a white aggressive deck or a blue-white slow controlling deck. The Wandering Emperor kind of feels like we're not abandoning all of our picks, but it doesn't work that well with everything. And I think it's about on par with Lingering Souls. Lingering Souls is cheaper, which is almost always my tiebreaker in Cube. It plays incredibly well with that Skull Clamp. It still plays fine with Murktide Regent and Treasure Cruise in that, you can flash it back to pump up your Regent, but mostly it plays well in a deck that might need to buy time and then do something explosive.
Sure.
But the 2 cards that I'm really looking at here are Cryptic Command I love that card, and if you're really on this blue train, which we've just taken a couple of blue cards, I think Cryptic Command is a very similar option to the Wandering Emperor, but is on color. And Lingering Souls is probably more powerful, follows the signal, works with the Skull Clamp, and also works with the Bloodstained Mires.
Gotcha. That's very helpful. I mean, I am definitely much less confident in my evaluation of the Wandering Emperor because it's still relatively new. I guess it's been almost a year, or has it been a whole year since Neon Dynasty?
It has. January 2022, I think.
Time is weird, but it still feels relatively new in my cube. It's been a year since it was added, but I haven't played with it myself and actually cast it myself as many times as I'd like to have a good solid evaluation of it. But yeah, I think what you're saying makes sense. Like, if it's even remotely close to a toss-up between Wandering Emperor and Lingering Souls on power level, then obviously Lingering Souls goes better with what we already have, and similar argument can be made for the Cryptic Command, especially if we're going to commit to being hard blue, which, who knows if that would have sent different signals to the drafters I'm passing to, which maybe would have made Pack 2 go better than it ended up going. So, you have this distinction in your notes you gave me between staying open and waffling. And would you consider this like very much a waffling pick if I take Wandering Emperor here, which is what I end up doing?
Yeah, I started talking about that, I think, in the next pack, but the Wandering Emperor does feel like we've sort of tentatively committed to a fairly narrow lane. And the Wandering Emperor, I'm fine with abandoning our picks, but it feels like we are moving away from the cards that we have when we don't need to. I don't think the Wandering Emperor is a compelling enough reason to deviate from what we're doing when Cryptic Command and Lingering Souls are more on point and are less committing.
So, what do you think of like blue-white tempo? And does the Wandering Emperor fit in that deck to you, or is it exclusively a control card from your perspective?
I think the Wandering Emperor is very strong in mono-white aggro. It's very strong in blue-white tempo. It's very strong in blue-white control. I think it is a very flexible card, or I guess to be clear, what the main thing I'm focusing on, I think, is the 2 white pips in its mana cost. We don't know if we're going to pick up the means to fix it. We already are looking to be heavy blue, and both of those blue cards, because they have Delve, want to go into somewhat narrow decks. I like the Wandering Emperor. I think it's a good power level outlier. I just think Lingering Souls and Cryptic Command are similar and more castable. And
Sure.
Lingering Souls in particular goes so nicely with that Skull Clamp that we don't have to abandon. And Cryptic Command is going to go well if we end up in a slower blue deck.
Sure. And then what do you think
Uh,
of blue-white tempo? Like, how do you feel about
love
that
it.
archetype in general?
My first real modern deck was Geist of St. Traft, so
There you go.
I am chasing that experience in every cube I draft.
Because I sometimes I think it is a viable deck in this cube, and I ended up playing a pretty bad variation of it, I think, in this draft. I think where the deck ended up, it's closest to being described as a sort of tempo deck, but it lacks all of the things the blue-white tempo deck wants most, namely all the cantrips and cards like Clarion Spirit and Monastery Mentor that pay you off for those things. And so I ended up kind of like with, instead of the cards that are good for that deck, really just like combining some blue spells with some white aggressive creatures and trying to like cobble something together. I sometimes feel like the blue-white tempo deck is just a little bit of a like the blue-red tempo deck at home kind of situation.
I think, yeah. I mean, the blue red tempo deck, I think, is going to be more fragile in that it can fail to itself. The blue red deck, like the issue with cards like Murktide Regent and even Treasure Cruise is cantrips are really, really powerful. But if you're just using cantrips mostly as Lotus Petals that draw you a card, it's you're not maximizing the value that you can get out of their cards. And blue red can lead you down that path where you only have like 6 relevant threats, and half of them require build up, like a Sprite Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Very powerful card, but it creates this tension where you don't want to proactively use your cantrips so that you don't end up fixing your draws so that the Sprite Dragon is better, and then you play the Sprite Dragon and it dies, and you've invested multiple cards into it. So
Mm-hmm.
even though you're not at card disadvantage, you have a very finite number of ways to win the game. Blue White Tempo, I think, can be more resilient in that it has more redundancy in its cards, but it can be more fragile in that it doesn't have an explosive game plan. So it's more likely to get run over when it's still building up its resources.
Gotcha. And what is it about the white that makes it more resilient, you think? Like, do you
Uh,
expect to play fewer cantrips in that deck than you do in the blue-red deck, for example?
I think it's two things, and I think it's about the impact of red more so than the impact of white. Red is going to give you good disruption, and red gives you very specific kinds of threats that either reward you for playing spells like Young Pyromancer, Third Path Iconoclast, Sprite Dragon, or are delve style spells like Murktide Regent, where just I don't know, you're building up and then spending all of that value on specific things.
Mm-hmm.
The white is going to just be more of you're playing good cards. You're going to have a harder time disrupting your opponent because there's only one Swords to Plowshares,
Right.
and things like Portable Hole can miss certain things or be answered. Um, Blue white is a less synergistic deck, and it's more of an overtly powerful deck.
Gotcha. Okay. Moving on then. Next pack here. So here I take the Thalia, right? I believe.
Yeah.
And again, another card that is not really. I mean, now we're back on. We're kind of just like going back and forth between, well, kind of 3 decks, like you said. A deck that is going to make Treasure Cruise and Murktide Region good, which here would want like Fire Ice or Seagate Stormcaller, even though those aren't super high picks in that deck. They're certainly better than Thalia is in that deck. Or a deck that's going to make Skull Clamp good, in which case Thalia is probably the pick here. Or a deck that's going to make the Wandering Emperor good, in which case none of these cards are fantastic with the Wandering Emperor if you're seeing it as primarily a control card. I
Mm-hmm.
think you said Fire Ice would be your pick here.
Look at this pack. I mean, I actually, in my notes, I tried not to just be like, this would be my pack.
Right, right, right.
This would be what I take out of
You
this
gave
pack.
much more context and,
I
feedback.
think my pick here is actually going to be Snuff Out.
Gotcha.
Snuff Out, free spell, works well with the Bloodstained Myers, works spell with our blue cards, and can work very well in a controlling shell of like, yes, the 4 life is painful, but free disruption is such a unique effect.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, yeah, Thalia is a bit of a waffle of like, Thalia really isn't going to go, as you said, with our blue cards, the Del plan. It's not actually that great with Skull Clamp, and it's sort of contingent on our ability to now wield cards like the Giver of Runes and the other Thalia that we passed.
Yeah.
And And also, frankly, I guess if we're really committing more to a load of the grand aggressive deck, I might actually just like Selfless Spirit more. It's cheaper and it makes the aggressive deck resilient against Wraths.
Sure. And at this point, 8 picks in, it's not like I'm just taking the best card out of every pack, in which case I might even just take Titania here. I think that card is absolutely cracked in this environment, but we're so far from a Titania deck that it's not even on my radar. Instead, it's like, well, we're probably playing blue or white or some combination thereof, so which of these cards is the best? And yeah, I think all of these are kind of middling, but I definitely see the arguments for the other ones rather than Thalia.
Yeah, and my question here, and something I'm often asking myself in the middle of the draft, is just sort of where are we right now? What signals are we receiving? The signal here is muddled. Titania is strong, but I'm not seeing like, oh, I'm in the wrong colors at this point.
Right.
And if you're not getting that signal and you're seeing cards that are in your colors, then it's which aspect, which of these lanes that I'm sort of standing in do I want to exist in, which goes well with my cards?
I do
It's
think
one thing
reading
to
signals is harder in Cube, but I think the only signal we've gotten that I think we can like say with some certainty is that red seems very not open. Everything else seems kind of a little bit fuzzy or up in the air, but I don't want to be playing red, I don't think, at this point.
Yeah.
Then this pack, we just get some lands here. We pick up an Elite Spellbinder, I think, for our deck. That's fine, presumably. I mean, I guess, if you take a Snuff out, are you looking at like a Disfigure out of this pack at that point?
Yeah, I could see the Disfigure. The Disfigure goes nicely with the Myers and the Bloodstained Myers, but given that we're now focusing more on white, the last couple cards we picked up were white cards, Spellbinder's a great pickup for a white aggressive or white mid-range deck.
Yeah, I think it seems like the best card in this pack in a vacuum, or as close as you can get to it, right? Like, I think it's more of a sign that people aren't taking white cards than Disfigure or Traverse or Tarfire, probably.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes, unless you're in a very specific environment, people are going to rate 1-for-1 removal, even cheap disruption, a little bit lower than 2-for-1s and exciting cards.
Right. And then I think these last couple picks here, you were just like, sure. Here, I think the Golos comes back around, and that is floated as an option. Let's see. Where'd that pack go? That's pack.
Oh, yeah, that's the one where we picked up Verdant Catacombs, I think.
Yeah. I'm trying to get there.
Oh, we picked up a Terminus here. I remember that.
We did get a Terminus on the wheel, which was something. Yeah, we got the Terminus and a Grim Flare. I guess did I take Grim Flare out of the Golos pack? No, wait, I did that. No, I took the Verdant Catacombs.
You took the Verdant Catacombs. Pack, yeah.
And here, I guess, you're like, hey, we're already kind of all over the place. Maybe we can take advantage of being all over the place and actually play this Golos.
Yeah, I mean, Golos isn't even that bad in a white-blue controlling shell.
That's fine.
The combination of mana advantage and a body is nice. I also like Blood Crypt here because it's notable we are picking up fetch lands and we have nothing to fetch yet.
Yes, that is true. You like Blood Crypt even though we think red is pretty solidly closed off just because it turns red fetches into black sources?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's Blood Crypt and Golos are both kind of hedges. Of Blood Crypt makes it so if we end up in a multicolored value pile, like those fetch lands are more likely to be live, and Golos can just sort of make whatever deck we make.
Right. All right, into pack 2. So here, I think I'm talking in the video here about how unhappy I am with the draft so far and my failed attempt to stay open. You said you're taking Godless Shrine here. I took the Mother of Runes. Talk me through this. Because
sure.
I guess so. In the parallel universe where you are drafting and took over, halfway through that pack, we would have a couple black cards, but I don't have any black cards except for a Fatal Push and I guess technically a Grim Flare. So is the Godless Shrine just a concession to turning the Blood Crypts into white sources, or is it also thinking about playing black cards?
It is mostly a concession to turning the Myers into white sources.
Right. Bloodstained Myers.
I think.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. I think the Mother of Runes is definitely a very, very powerful card. I think wherever the heavy white drafter is, they're probably going to be within the 3 seats to our left. We passed the Thalia, we passed the relatively late Giver of Runes. Nothing came back, including the balance. So there's probably multiple white drafters. And because we are in multiple lanes at once of this like blue delve deck, white aggro deck, blue-white control deck, the Godless Shrine, I think, is just so incredibly likely to make our deck
Hmm.
and to make it so that we can keep open, hedge, and our mana is more likely to work out. And I don't feel like we're giving up terribly much. We've got two perfectly fine blue cards. We've got Sensei's Defining Top, Stonecoil Serpent, Rishadan Port. I don't feel like we're missing any major power level outliers here, whereas the Mother of Runes works with like three of our cards, I think.
Yeah,
It's
and
good
not
with
even
Wandering Emperor, Thalia, and Skullclamp.
yeah, and I guess theoretically the Murktide Regent, but that's a very weird combination. It works with
Yeah,
it in the sense that it literally can protect it, but you don't generally want to have them both in the same deck.
but we take the mom here, and it's okay. We're pushing more into a white tempo deck or a white aggressive deck. This pack.
Yes. So I guess the sort of it's funny. It feels like the narrative here is that I am trying to stay open in places where you would have stayed open differently, which is to say, just taking more flexible cards. Whereas I'm trying to stay open, as in read the table and take the powerful cards, even if they're committal, in the hopes that the packs will later on reward me for doing so because those colors were in fact open. That idea, that kind of drafting to stay open, I think is kind of flawed in Cube. At least every time I've tried to do it, I feel like I just keep getting burned by it because
Which idea, to be clear?
the idea of staying open as in just taking the most powerful card out of every pack, because that's a sign that, the whole idea that it's you're it's a concession now, right? Because it's a card that maybe doesn't go with what you've already taken, but you're taking it because of the value of future picks you're going to get in those colors theoretically by reading the table. I think reading the table is so hard in Cube that most times where I think I'm getting some edge or some percentage by reading the table, I'm actually just giving up percentage by not taking on color cards that work with my previous picks and instead like changing lanes.
Yeah, and I think we have this excellent example right now of like what does staying open truly mean. This is the staying open versus waffling discussion that we started in the previous pack.
Yeah.
I'm seeing staying open as you are taking cards that are likely to work out in a variety of different decks. Yes, that predisposes me to playing multicolor decks or just two color decks with a bit of a splash. Um, Whereas what we have now is a bunch of cards that go into a relatively narrow array of archetypes. It's highly unlikely they're all going to mesh in the same deck. And that's what I would call waffling. And I think an issue that a lot of people will run into in their very first cube draft is they see all these cards that they're familiar with, either through lore or playing with, and they just take all these really cool, powerful cards, and then they don't have a very functional archetype because the cards don't play well together. They're just generically good. Some cubes are conducive to those kinds of
Mm-hmm.
experiences.
I don't think
But
mine generally is, for what it's worth. Like, I think if you try and draft just good cards, you will get run over by a deck that is either really committed to, somewhere on the like tempo and attrition axis, like a really super aggressive deck or a really super controlling deck that's really focused in that sense, or a deck that has synergies like, all the spells with the delve things or all the spells with spell cast triggers or, a ramp, I guess, is a kind of synergy deck. I think those, or like, we talked about that Collective Company 3-drop tribal deck, right? Like that deck that is thinking about how those cards interact, I think beats a deck that's just playing good stuff most of the time. So here, Fable is the pick for you. And it's interesting because I'm looking at Fable and saying, yeah, Fable's definitely the strongest card in this pack, but we're like this far into the draft, we have no red cards. I guess you could count Bloodstained Mire as a red card. We have no red cards, and I just felt like I couldn't afford to, waffle further, I guess, is what it comes down to. Like, at this point, I felt like I was waffling because we're already in pack 2 and no longer, like, trying to find our lane. And you, by comparison, are saying, hey, yeah, even though it is, not on strategy in terms of color, it is actually on strategy in terms of it being just generically good, right? Like, you'll play this card in basically any deck, which is not true of Mother of Runes, Murktide Regent, Skullclamp, the other, like, power outliers that I took with the hopes of, quote-unquote, trying to stay open.
yeah, I believe that Fable of the Mirror Breaker is one of the most powerful cards released in 2022.
Card's
The
nuts.
card it just does everything. And I think you talked about this. I really appreciated Sam Black talking about it on Drafting Archetypes of this is almost a trap card for cube designers at the risk of going too much into cube design.
No, I think
Of
people
just
will
like
love that.
it has every synergy under the sun. So basically every cube designer is like, oh, it fits in my cube because it's an enchantment and it creates multiple game objects, and it transforms, and it makes tokens, and it works with sacrifice
Cares about
things.
artifacts. It cares about discard. It cares about all these things. Yeah.
Yes, it does. It has every synergy under the sun. It's also so ludicrously powerful that it just keeps going up and up in my estimation. And I agree with you that like we're not sure what our lane is going to be, and I'll recenter by. I mean, especially I think we just got past this.
Yeah, this is
I'm just going to take
pick 2 of pack 2.
It's an incredibly powerful card. We're going to probably wheel one of those Bloodstained Mires. We do already have a couple bits of fixing that are going to work with it. I just want to refocus by taking a really, really powerful card. I could also see the Ledger Shredder because it'll go so well with our blue cards.
Right. And safe to say that, like, because Fable is such a flexible power outlier, I should say in this cube, right, like, I don't see it as a payoff for discard or a payoff for artifacts. Like, it's in here as a generically good card, right, that can kind of just fit anywhere and does the things that it does. I'm trying to think of a red card that is of a similar power level but much more committal, and I'm actually struggling to think of anything that fits that definition. Honestly, I think Young Pyromancer might be the closest, right? In the right deck, you can definitely make Young Pyromancer better than Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but it requires a lot of commitment, and so you wouldn't take a Young Pyromancer here and be like, well, that deck's open, because you would need to be committed to it. Like, it's that it's a power outlier and also that it is generically powerful and works kind of no matter what our deck is doing.
Yeah. And Young Pyromancer is another one of those great cards like Sprite Dragon where you need everything to work out. And also, if your opponent disrupts you right as you're getting going, all of your work is undone, and you might not have that many more ways to win the game.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I took the Polluted Delta after all that conversation.
Which makes sense in that it's our first blue fetch. It recenters us in more of the blue-white tempo deck or a blue-red spells deck. I think it's defensible. I just would argue against it when you have a major power outlier like Fable the Mirror Breaker or a unique archetype piece like Ledger Shredder.
Yeah, I think it's really eye-opening to, again, just focus on this distinction of the kind of power outlier, because in my head, I think Fable and Murktide Regent are kind of like on par in this cube, right? And you might think that's crazy. Maybe Fable's just, way better because it's like doesn't require any commitment and still pounds no matter what. But to me, they're kind of on a similar power level, but admittedly, Murktide Regent is not anywhere near as flexible. You have to have a deck that optimizes Murktide Regent for it to begin to challenge Fable the Mirror Breaker on power level. So pack one, pick one. You take the Fable every time. If you already have a couple blue fetch or blue cantrips or something, then maybe you can argue for the Murktide Regent. But it's the nature of the power outlier that determines the viability of a staying open pick as opposed to just a waffling around and taking powerful cards that don't do anything with each other kind of pick.
Yeah, there's just no opportunity cost for Fable, whereas Murktide has a higher fail rate.
Yeah, definitely. Then here, I took this Opt, I believe, and yeah, you were basically saying you would take a Sacred Foundry here, which obviously if you were in... That doesn't work with any of our fetch lands, I don't think. I mean, it again turns our Bloodstained Mires into white sources, yeah.
Which is exactly what I'm thinking about at this point. Part of this is how, which are any of these cards deeply exciting to me? I think the Opt is going to go well with our blue cards. It's going to go well with our blue-white deck. We don't actually have that many cards for that deck, however.
Yeah.
Like, we've got Terminus, Murktide Regent, which already don't go that great together. Treasure Cruise, Thalia, we might be able to cobble together a Skull Clamp. The Sacred Foundry just ties a bunch of different pieces together. Mm-hmm. It makes it so the Bloodstained Mires that are going to go nicely with our Delve spells can now fetch white sources. If we can get enough fetchable white sources, we'll play the Bloodstained Mires even with no swamps or mountains in our deck. And then that ties the room together.
At what point do you give up on a deck, right? Like, you were like, we're not a great Murktide Regent deck right now, and we're not. And the question is, does this Opt represent 5 more blue cantrips we're going to get in the future, or is it already too late, essentially, to know that that ship is basically sailed?
I think, there's that, if you walked away from the computer and I was drafting right now, what would I be thinking?
Other than, how did I get here with these awful picks? Who was drafting for me before this?
I am not approaching this draft with that negativity. If anything, I find it's really interesting being in somebody else's shoes. And I also recognize, I think you set yourself up to be under a fair bit of pressure of, this is my try-hard draft.
Yeah, that's what I get for try-harding. I genuinely think that, that is part of the, like, if I was just drafting for content or whatever, right? I think I would just be like, yeah, here's the thing, I'm gonna do it kind of no matter what, right? Like commit to something earlier on and like not try to stay open, which ended up resulting in waffling here. Like I do think I kind of set a trap for myself.
And I think that is such an important distinction that a lot of people are going to struggle with, of taking draft picks that are going to make a variety of decks. I would say is staying open. Taking really narrow power level outliers that don't play with each other is waffling between different things.
And
If
that's
you
probably different in like retail limited, where the power outliers are so much better than the rest of the pack, right? Like if you're playing some retail limited set and, you know, pack 2 you get like a third pick absolute, you know, S++ bomb in some color, like that to me is like a sign, oh, that color is clearly not being drafted, because there's no world in which you wouldn't take that if that wasn't being drafted. But you never get a signal that bright in Cube, because people could just disagree on the power level of Murktide Region or Treasure Cruise or whatever, because it's never like the difference between Glorybringer and, you know, the best common in Amonkhet. It's the difference between like two very, very good cards.
Yeah, I mean, with the asterisk of like some cubes have massive power level spikes where the best cards are so much better than everything else.
Right.
Vintage
like
Cube being an
Moxen,
example of
yeah.
that. Yeah. But also lower rarity cubes that are, or not even lower rarity cubes, but just like lower power level cubes that still have a couple major power level outliers in it.
Yeah.
But yeah, getting back to this draft, this pack is an opportunity to right the ship and see which of these options do we want to commit to. If we want to commit to white aggro, we take the Student of Warfare. If we want to commit hard to the blue cantrip deck, we take the Opt. The Sacred Foundry I like because it keeps us open.
Right. You're saying let's still not commit. Let's still delay that commitment, or at least.
And also it ties different cards together, which is really nice.
Yeah.
It's a way of having our cake, or eating our cake and having it too.
There's a lot of this like domino effect too, which I also felt in the games that Brian coached me on, which is like, had I taken the Fable, like, yeah, Sacred Foundry, 100% get in my deck. Right now, like, you're not only like fixing my mana for white, but you're also letting me cast this card that I just kind of somewhat greedily took that was, you know, a different, I was a little bit outside of the lane I was in. So it's like, had I taken more open picks early, then, you know, cards like Fable would have felt like they were on the table, whereas I had kind of priced myself out of them, at least in my head at this point in the draft.
Yeah, and yeah, I think you felt more committed than I felt that we were. We waffled a bit, but I'm so infrequently worried about getting enough playables in Cube, just because it's Cube. You trust the Cube designer. Every card is good and playable.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I see where this is where we start looking back against at a blue-white control deck, and I don't hate where we are.
Yeah. I don't want to take up your whole evening, so maybe we'll play this, and I think we've covered a lot of like the big ideas, and we'll just keep talking as this plays, if that's fine with you. I don't think we have to go
This
pick
is where
by
we take Fractured Identity, right?
I believe so. Though I gotta be honest, I think Fractured Identity is like only fine in my cube just because of how low curving it is.
Which is crazy to me.
Right, it's crazy to think, but like if you're stealing a 1 or 2 drop, which some decks only have 1 or 2 drops for you to steal, like it's still good. It's still a 2-for-1, right? You still exile their thing, so there's no shenanigans with it. But we did get that Teferi too, which is worth noting as like, I think I said at this point in the video, that's the first thing that feels like a good sign in this whole draft.
Yeah,
and
the Pack 2 Pick 5 Teferi was such a huge signal. And yeah, now we're just a blue-white tempo, blue-white control deck.
Yeah, for better or worse. And, you know, I did end up, I mean, I played 4 matches with this deck, and I went, well, one of the matches was technically 2-2 in games, but we didn't count the first game for complicated reasons because we weren't filming. And then we played a match after the first game, which I won, and I lost that match 1-2. So that one, we call it a draw, call it a loss. And then the other 3 matches I played, I lost 1 and won 2 of them. So the deck actually did not play that badly when I actually played out the games, right? It was fine, even though it felt like such a disaster in the actual draft. So it's also maybe just like not... Another thing that could happen here is it's maybe just not my idea in my head of what I want blue-white to be doing, even if it does actually work, right? You combine these cards together, they're fine, and I think Brian was like, this is just a flyers deck, right? This is an evasive, you know, deck that has removal spells and flyers, right? That's what you should be like thinking of your deck as, which... I never would have said, yeah, there's a blue-white flyers deck in my cube or whatever, right?
Yep. And yeah, I think this was the right the ship moment of we just got very clear signals that blue-white is open. I think I do disagree with your pick here.
Did I take the Glimmer Lens here, or did I get that later on the wheel?
I think you got that later. I think you took a 2-drop here. Oh, no, yes, you did take the Glimmer Lens here. And that was we just got the Teferi and the Fractured Identity that say, like, a tempo control deck is exactly what we want. I love a Hallowed Fountain. The Steam Vents is notable because you may notice I keep going back to this. What turns on our fetch lands? Steam Vents turns on our fetch lands.
Right.
And Mystic Confluence is great. But the Glimmer Lens here was surprising because it felt like we just got the control signal was open, and Glimmer Lens is really only going to pay off if we're attacking reliably and often, which is not what like Teferi is going to be very good at enabling.
Yeah, I don't have the audio on here, but I'm clearly waffling between the Hallowed Fountain and the Glimmer Lens. And I think one thing that's interesting here is in my cube at least, I'm almost never looking to like half color shock lands for mana fixing. And part of that might be that I do have 3 of each shock land, so it's kind of like, you'll have opportunities. You'll definitely have opportunities to take those off color ones eventually, right? We've seen a Godless Shrine, a couple Sacred Foundries, and a Steam Vents now that were all like half color shock lands for our deck, and we'll see more. I was also just kind of like, we will see a Hallowed Fountain, was kind of my impression. Like, given that we saw Teferi, we'll see a Hallowed Fountain. I think here I'm mostly talking about whether or not we'll see another Hallowed Fountain, because we do have the one fetchable, which is like price of entry. You have to have one fetchable for those cards to even work. You really want an untapped one so you can sequence things better. Did I actually take Glimmer Lens here, or did I take the Hallowed Fountain and wheel it?
No, we took the Glimmer Lens here, which is relevant because it's not until pack 3, pick 8 that we get a Hallowed Fountain.
Yeah, that feels surprising to me that I did that. I mean, this comes back to Brian's point of like, I make people bring footage and make them face the fact that you made these decisions. This is what you did. Because me sitting here today, I don't think I'd take Glimmer Lens out of that pack, and this was only me 3 weeks ago, right? So it's interesting that.
And then we get the Ledger Shredder back, which is just like the hallelujah moment.
Yes,
everything is coming together. The signal is really strong.
That was another great sign. Yeah.
Yeah, you take Force Spike. I think it's fine. I like Absence, but it's not clear that our mana is going to work out here.
I really like that card. I think my play group is lower on it than I am. I just like it as like any kind of removal in any kind of proactive deck, or even honestly not that proactive. It's still a removal spell, and so often I feel like you can, especially in my cube, I don't know if this is anecdotal, make their draw worse with the unexpectedly absent than it would be, right? Like they have a creature they've put counters on, or they have, something they've invested some resources into somehow, or you just bounce their like, cheap creature that's just a blocker in the late game, and they're going to draw this like cheap creature again instead of maybe a big spell that saves them, right? Like I feel like that is so often upside on unexpectedly absent.
Yeah, it throws off their curve even in the early game.
Yeah. All right, the rest of his pack. Let's see. Do you have any other major notes? The rest of his pack. Look at the here too.
The big thing. The thing in packs 1 and 2 was about staying open versus waffling.
Yeah.
The thing in pack 3 is about we know our lane is open, and once you identify that an archetype is open, it's good to start thinking in advance of what are the things that I need? What's missing from my deck? What does this archetype need? What are the real contours of this archetype that I'm playing?
Let's take a second guess. So if you're looking at this deck, what do you think we are missing and need most? Like, what are the things that jump out to you?
So I think we have some vestigial pieces of a white aggressive deck. The Mother of Ruins doesn't seem great to me. It doesn't have many things to protect. It feels like Mother of Ruins, Fairy Vandal, Glimmer Lens, Thalia, and possibly but not definitely Skull Clamp are a little out of place with some very powerful blue controlling cards. We don't have enough fixing. Like part of the reason that I keep looking for those like half color fetchables is those Bloodstained Mires are doing nothing for us right now. But if we pick up 4 fetchables with them, suddenly they're helping fix our mana.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't end up playing the Bloodstained Mires because they didn't end up doing anything for me, nor the Verdant Catacombs. So I did pick up more fetch lands. I think mana base ended up okay, but like you said, maybe just by luck because we didn't get our actual Hallowed Fountain until pack 3 and pretty late in pack 3.
Yeah, it was pack 3, pick 8. It was the last chance that we could get it.
Oh, amazing.
But like I look at this and I see, okay, this Fairy Vandal needs help to be good. The Mother of Ruins doesn't work, so we need ways to stay alive. We need ways to shore up our mana base. As a control deck, we kind of have enough ways to win the game. We just need ways to find those cheap spells to enable our delve cards. This is the missing treasure cruise, which is going to happen in the middle of the draft. If it just disappears from your window.
There was a weird bug with MTGA draft, and everyone else was having a similar experience. They would like move a card and it would just blink out of existence. So there's a treasure cruise there, even though it doesn't look like it. I did draft it, I swear.
And so this is the point. Going into pack 3, we know the archetype is open. I wrote down a list for you of just like in the moment, what are the things this deck needs? what are the bigger things it's missing, and then what are their general priorities. I feel like
Yeah,
we're
this all
pretty good. Yeah.
you wrote this list surrounding the pick of Timeless Dragon, right? So this
Yes.
pick right here, as this pack comes into existence here. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I guess this was two things for me. So I guess at this point I did not really think of myself as a control deck, which maybe I just should have, right? I had a Terminus that I wasn't even putting in the main board as I was building up the deck, right? And Terminus was in there. If I had fully given up on Mother of Runes, Thalia, Glimmerlens, maybe Elite Spellbinder, or maybe you probably keep that one. Those cards just not being in my deck, then it would have been much easier to navigate this last pack, I think, because I would have said I am a control deck. What I desperately need is one more Wrath, some single target removal, and cantrips that give me some card selection. Which instead I was like, I don't know what I am in this weird, blue-white tempo deck that's missing Clarion Spirit and Monastery Mentor and only has one cantrip so far, so I don't know what that deck is, but I'm going to try and make the best pick for it. And here I was just like, well, my deck is kind of aimless, and Timeless Dragon is generically fine, right? It's not Fable of the Mirror Breaker generically great. It's generically fine, right? It's a big flyer that fixes your mana, very low cost of inclusion in your deck. It's never a dead card. It doesn't require any synergy. To me, it was like, okay, this kind of patches up the holes in my deck that are otherwise like I don't have anything that just works. Everything else requires some weird commitment one direction or the other.
And I agree with you that the card is fine, but I would preface it as I'd say the card is merely fine. It does a bunch of different things. It doesn't do a lot of them very well. And what it does best is be sort of a sticky mid-range endgame win condition, which I think is what this deck is currently strongest in. You've got multiple very powerful high-end spells. I look at this deck and I think we really need to shore up our mana base. The Misty Rainforest fetches our one blue-white source. That's huge. The Shelduck Isle is effectively another cheap spell. The Baleful Strix is the best card in the pack. And if we take that Baleful Strix, we'll probably wheel at Fetid Pools, and then Bloodstained Mire and the Polluted Delta will then turn this on, which now gives us card advantage and a cheap spell.
And it would have been great to have been able to play Fatal Push too, because I would have loved some more cheap removal.
Yeah.
And then this pack happens, and I'm just cursing at the heavens because I'm like, well, this is awful because this pack is so good for my deck. Everything except for Murderous Rider, Field of the Dead, I'm like, yeah, I would play all of these cards probably. Heartbreaker.
And I think you nail it with this one. I think this is one of the best picks of the draft, where you just focus in on exactly what matters. Of the biggest weakness this deck has is its mana, and taking Celestial Colonnade is excellent.
Is that what I took here? Did I not take Brazen Bar?
I would look so stupid right now if I'm wrong. I think you take the Colonnade.
Well, let's keep watching. I think I did Brazen Borrower.
I thought you hedged to the same. I mean, Brazen Borrower was great. I would not shame anybody for getting it. But well, we'll see. I might have so much egg on my face at this point. Because I remember you were about to take the Brazen Bar. No, you did take the Brazen Bar.
Yeah.
Oh, never mind. Well, I feel like
because I don't think I had Colonnade in my finished deck.
No, you're right. You didn't.
I don't think
I'll say. All right, so. Well, I apologize to Andy of 30 seconds ago. I was like, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. Brazen Bar was a great pickup. It's more of a tempo-oriented
As long
card.
as you're proud of me, right? I don't care how we get there.
Yep. Here, I think you end up taking Force of Negation.
Yeah, which, looking at this right now, it's like with Spell Queller feels like it's pretty darn on strategy with these flyers, and it's an answer while also applying some pressure in the same way that Brazen Borrower is. Force of Negation, the forces in this cube are interesting because you're not protecting a combo with them. You can't really protect combo Force of Negation anyway because it's only free on your opponent's turn. You're also not stopping combos with them, right? You're not stopping this super key spell. I like the most when I'm in a deck that does have the Young Pyromancers, Monastery Mentors, those Sprite Dragons, things that you desperately want to protect, and you can afford to tap out with your cantrips to get the max value out of that payoff while still holding up a counterspell if they do have a removal spell for it. I don't love it in this deck, certainly, and I think I only ever hard cast it. Maybe I free cast it once in one of my games with this deck, but I pretty much was just hard casting it as a bad negate most of the time.
Yeah, and I think it's a perfectly fine pickup. It's notable that we issued a more control-friendly card in the previous pack to take a more tempo-friendly card, and then in this pack we're not taking the tempo-focused card, but we are still taking a 3-drop.
Yeah. A little all over the place.
But like this is less a like we're flailing at options, and it's more we're deciding between two similar but still slightly different archetypes.
I feel like we had way more options for cards I wanted to put in my deck in Pack 3 than I did in Pack 2 or Pack 1. Just in terms of, like, I had identified my lane more, and also I do think that more of the cards just happened to be in Pack 3 for our deck, which happens sometimes. That's how draft works.
Yeah, I don't know what people ended up in, but either blue-white opened up in the middle of Pack 2, or it just the cards weren't there.
But, like, here, I would rate Stoneforge Mystic, Lose Focus, Miscalculation higher than half the cards in our main deck, right? I want those cards so badly, and I could only have one of them, you know? I actually think I did wield the Miscalculation, not if memory serves, which is great. Besides the blue actually was open. I would also play Retrofitter Foundry in this deck pretty excitedly, but...
so we get the Stoneforge. We've got 2 pieces of equipment to get back.
Here's an interesting question. Actually, what did you say about this comment here? You did agree with Memory Lapse being the pick in this pack, which makes me happy as a cube designer, because I think I said here I wanted Memory Lapse to be the pick and not the 4-mana Planeswalker, so I was glad to hear you say that you would also take the same thing.
Yeah, I think we need more cheap cards than we need ways to win the game, and Elspeth is better in... We're moving towards a more proactive deck, but she's even better in proactive decks than she is in controlling decks.
Yeah. I love that Planeswalker so much that I even tolerate the repeatable, egregious life gain on it. I love the downtick only Planeswalkers that can be recurred. I think it's such a cool design to me. I'm really into it. So it tugs at my heartstrings, even though it doesn't fit some of my other goals perfectly. Did take the Memory Lapse here, and then let's see here. Your last big comment here. Yeah, the pick 12 in this pack. We'll jump to that here.
The Supreme Verdict.
Right. And again, if I had, coming into this pack, been like, we're blue-white control, I would have made some substantially different picks that I think would have put us in a different spot, where having Supreme Verdict and Terminus and the number of Planeswalkers we have, we could have definitely been a very good control deck. But I was looking at this stack of, 8, 13... I was looking at the stack of 12 creatures and being like, that's too many creatures. I can't put a Supreme Verdict to my 12 creature deck, which is probably not the right attitude.
Yeah, and I mean, there's notes specific to Ameria's call of I found it to underperform from the promise that it has, but yeah, I think this is also part of this is I think I like pure control decks a bit more than you do, and I'm looking to do that. Which doesn't make it correct. It makes it a preferential difference.
What I actually took here was the Spell Dancer, for what it's worth, though. I was
you did?
This freeze frame, I'm hovered over the Amiria's Call. But I took the Spell Dancer, and I did not end up main decking it nor siding it in.
Yeah, it doesn't work with as many of our cards as we want, even though we still have the dream of double Treasure Cruise.
Yeah, or double Fractured Identity, which would be pretty sick. But
so now we like Fractured Identity.
Well, when you can copy it, I mean, it's better if you copy it, certainly. And then this draft kind of, wraps up, and we get a couple cards late, and then we so the final deck, let's actually, does this video have the deck build? Yeah, let's get to the final deck build here, and I'm just curious if you agree on the final construction of this deck, given the pool we had. So obviously all of the comments about the draft aside, we ended up with this as the main deck. I think this is the best freeze frame here, right? I'm starting to see this is the main deck. Yeah, pretty sure this is what I ran main deck. Does that make sense to you? Is there anything you're looking to cut or looking to put in from the sideboard here? I don't have a great picture of the sideboard, unfortunately. Terminus is in the sideboard as the main sideboard consideration, maybe. Force Spike is in the sideboard, was one of the last cuts.
I'm looking at that Skull Clamp, and I feel like the whole Stoneforge Mystic package is not going to perform as well as we want it to.
No, certainly.
the clamp kills almost nothing. The Glimmer Lens isn't going to have the easiest time ever drawing a card. The Fairy Vandal isn't going to have the easiest time getting bigger, and if it is getting bigger, it's because we have a Teferi in play, and then the Fairy Vandal doesn't need the help.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a stronger version of this deck is slower and playing cards like Terminus. We can't see everything that we're not playing, but I think we're not missing that much. But I feel like that Stoneforge
here.
I
can we find the picture of the full pool? Here's the full pool. So if we can remember what we weren't playing. So we're not playing Fractured Identity, Force Spike, Mercurial Spell Dancer, Flicker Wisp, And I think that's it on color in our sideboard, basically.
I think I'd be
Terminus.
looking to cut the 3 cards of the Stoneforge package, the Fairy Vandal, and then probably just play Fractured Identity because it is such a powerful catch-up card.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I need to see everything else that we're not. Oh yeah, we have the portable hole. So we're cutting 3 cards. We get Fractured Identity. We get Terminus. And then I'd probably just play. I think we were playing 15 lands. I'd probably go up to 16.
This is definitely at least either 16. It might have even been a 17 land deck. This
I,
says
I'm counting 6 lands.
6 lands of 32 cards would put us to.
Just
Why can't
14.
I do math? That's definitely not right. So I must have had more cuts to make at
Yeah.
this point. All right, yeah, 16 lands where we ended up. This was the final deck, so I guess I also shaved off 1 or 2 things from that screenshot. Sorry if this is a little haphazard. First time doing this, I'll learn.
So,
Ended up on 16 lands, so you're saying you would go down Skull Clamp, Glimmerlens, Stoneforge Mystic, and up Fracture Identity, Terminus, and...
possibly just a land to go to 17.
I mean, I think an extra land here is fine. We have a cycling land, and we have...
I looked to see if there was something I could cut the Fairy Vandal for, just because it seems like the Fairy Vandal is going to be relatively anemic.
Yeah. I like that card a lot in decks that want to hold up counter magic and also want to put threats into play. The fact that it's got flash is so relevant, but I don't have that much counter magic, right? I've got Memory Lapse, Miscalculation, Condescend, and Censor that I can reasonably hold up and then play a Fairy Vandal. So not the best Fairy Vandal deck either.
Oh, and you have Flicker Wisp. I might play... It's a little harder the mana, but the mana's not that bad. I might play Flicker Wisp over something like Thalia.
Yeah.
Or if there's a different cut, just because... I don't know. Flicker Wisp, resetting it to Fairy is nice. Flicker Wisp is a nice disruptive piece. But yeah, I don't dislike this deck. Like, you were harder in this deck than I would be, and I think you built the version of it that you're going to be most comfortable with playing. I don't think this draft was a train wreck. I just think it was... The mana's a little bit weaker than it needs to be. It's a little bit shorter on 1-drops than it probably wants to be. But I don't know. I'm pretty hard on my decks. I feel like this is like, I don't know, a C class deck, which is certainly not a train wreck.
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember a time that I felt like a draft went worse in my own cube. Though I've definitely had decks that have performed worse, but usually it's because like I'm trying to do something in the draft that's maybe a little bit greedy or weird, or I'm trying to test something out, and it's like, okay, this deck didn't come together, but I was able to draft what I was trying to draft, right? Whereas here, I felt like I had so little control over the draft, and everything was constantly breaking all the time, and we ended up somewhere that was fine. I agree, this is like a C minus probably sort of deck. It's actually the Skull Clamp thing is really interesting, right? Because in all the matches I played, every time I cast Stoneforge Mystic, right, I evaluated the current board state and was like, what do I want? And I just always wanted Glimmerlens every single time. I always wanted a 2/2 that I could put into play, right? I just wanted another creature to affect the board and not a Skull Clamp, right? Because like you said, I have nothing I can really combo with it. I'm not going to be like destroying a bunch of creatures with it. It's just going to be a value Skull Clamp. And in all situations, I was like, I'd rather just have a 2/2 right here. So it was really not a Skull Clamp deck at the end of the day, and maybe it should have just been cut. That is honestly not a terrible suggestion. It just, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Stoneforge Mystic isn't that exciting when it's a Squire that draws you a Grizzly Bears.
Mm-hmm. Well put.
Yeah. And I say that as somebody who absolutely loves Stoneforge Mystic, but you either need a good toolbox of cards, or like if this were a white aggressive deck, those would be outstanding hits.
Right, of course.
Just, yeah.
And, this deck is not like maximizing any of its cards, right? Like every single card in this deck, I feel like could be maximized in a different deck and made better. But it's like they're all fine. They all do something, you know.
I think I think there's a couple changes I would make based on what we have in the sideboard, but it is worth noting, like, can this deck protect a Teferi? Either Teferi or a Wandering Ember? Yeah, it could do a decent job of that.
Mm-hmm.
Can this deck apply early pressure and then back it up with counter magic? Not really. It can really
sometimes if you get a lucky draw.
If you get a Ledger Shredder into a bunch of counter magic.
Mm-hmm. Which I would have had in game 1 of the recorded match if I hadn't had my Mother of Runes, then my Ledger Shredder removed. It would have been Mother of Runes, Ledger Shredder, followed by other stuff, but my opponent just removed both those things, and then my deck did nothing.
And it is worth noting that there's some, but not a ton of synergy between pieces. The biggest synergies I feel like you have in this deck are flash cards and delve cards. Of the fact that you can play at instant speed, and then the fact that by trading one for one, you can recoup major advantage by either delving out a treasure cruise or just slamming a Teferi or out of the board a fractured identity and just invalidate a whole bunch of what the opponent has done.
Yeah, this deck is so good at trading 1-for-1, except it has no 1-for-1 removal spells that go in the graveyard, except for Prismatic Ending. Portable Hole just stays in play, doesn't fuel Delve, and the Brazen Barber's like petty theft just goes on an adventure, right? Like the actual interaction is not fueling Delve. Yeah, it's a pile. This is, I think, a kind of as close to, this is as bad as decks get in my cube, I think, in terms of just being good stuff piles. But still functions because it's cube. The cards are all good. You can still play Magic with it, and yeah. I don't want to take up your whole evening. This was really, really super helpful, though. I really love talking about this and this idea of, I know I'm going to look differently in the future about, in regards to what staying open means, right? And looking at a power outlier that comes to me, pick 4, pick 5, pack 1, and evaluating it differently depending on how committal it is in terms of what kind of deck it needs to be in for it to actually be a power outlier, right? Because in this draft was a perfect example, right? I took Murktide Regent because it seemed like a power outlier, and then in this deck it is absolutely not. In this deck it is exactly as mid as you described it, right? It is a like mid-game 5/5 maybe, right? It is not that good in this deck, and that is why you would have taken it lower, which I didn't, and hopefully lesson learned. We'll see.
And also, like, it could just be that the cards didn't cut the way that you were looking for in this particular draft. Murktide Regent could be
Probably a little bit of
absolutely as
both.
powerful as you describe it to be, which is why I never try and pretend like any advice I'm providing is gospel, especially to the cube owner.
Well, don't give me too much credit as the cube owner, but yeah, thanks. This was great. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you so much for having me. This was it was definitely fun to sit in the passenger seat and get into somebody else's mind.
Well, it's a scary place in there, so I'm glad you had a good time.